All right, so we can slowly start. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. And a special thanks is to our eminent guest and speaker, Professor David Kennedy. It's truly an honor to welcome you all to the School of Research inaugural lecture. As this is my first time addressing you in this capacity, I'm especially thrilled to share this important moment with all of you as we continue to build our community of inquiry and critical engagement in our different capacities of work and research. I look forward to many more occasions where we can come together as part of the School of Research to exchange ideas, challenge assumptions, and deepen our critical engagement in trying to understand the challenges of our world. One of the main characteristics of the School of Research is the richness of our interdisciplinary community. Our school is not just a collection of departments and fields, but really a space where ideas meet, evolve, and challenge one another. This inaugural lecture is an embodiment of that spirit. That's why today's event is not designed as a lecture, but as a conversation, a format that reflects really my deep desire to foster debate, inclusion, and collaborative thinking. It is through these conversations that we can draw on the full range of insights within our interdisciplinary community, embracing the complexities of issues we study and the diversity of the perspectives we hold. And there is no one more fitting to lead this discussion than our distinguished guest, Professor David Kennedy. I'm thrilled to introduce Professor Kennedy, whose work has been at the forefront of thinking critically about law, political economy, and the intersections that shape our world. Professor Kennedy is the Manley O. Hudson Professor of Law and Director of the Institute for Global Law and Policy at Harvard Law School, where he teaches international law, international economic policy, legal theory, law and development, and European law. He has had a profound influence on the study of law and global governance, particularly in how he critically interrogates the structures of international law and political economy. His research uses interdisciplinary materials from sociology and social theory, economics and history to explore issues of global governance, development policy, and the nature of professional expertise. His research also draws upon his experience working with governments and international organizations, bringing a unique blend of scholarship and practical experience. Throughout his career, he has written extensively on international law, global governance, human rights, and the role of expertise, and much more. And his groundbreaking work, such as The Dark Sides of Virtue, A World of Struggle, and more recently, Of Law and the World, challenges us to think differently about power, inequality, and the global structures that define our political and economic systems. We are privileged to have Professor Kennedy with us today to lead this conversation on the intersection of law, political economy, and critique, and I'm sure it will inspire us to think about new avenues for our own research and exploration. With that, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Professor Kennedy, thanking him for taking the time to travel in person to engage in this important discussion, and thank you all for joining us today, and I look forward to the conversation as it unfolds. Please join me in welcoming Professor Kennedy. This event is organized as a conversation, so we'll kick it off with a question and then a series of questions first from me, and then hoping for you to engage at the end with your own questions as we follow. So you've written about a lot of subjects. You had a book about war, a book about Chinese economic development, another about refugee affairs, the UN, and you've written many articles about trade, the structure of the European Union, geopolitical strategy, political economy, and much more. And in all these works that you've produced, law figures as a central thread. Can you tell us why, and how law is relevant to all these things?
Well, let me first start off by saying thank you for what a great introduction. It's really thrilling to be here at Sciences Po and to be part of this moment of interdisciplinarity that is going on among all of you and among the programs here. So it's a particularly distinctive privilege to be part of the conversation. Well, that's a hard question. So I guess for me, I always started off with something in society that I wanted to understand because I didn't think it was working very well. So that could be patterns of inequality, development projects that didn't seem to be achieving their objective, For a long time, I was interested in humanitarian projects on the global stage relating to human rights or refugee protection and so forth that were somehow misfiring or seemed to me limited in how they were approaching a problem, or to be maybe part of the problem that they were trying to address, or part of how the problem was being reproduced, and I wanted to figure out why. So I think you get into an interdisciplinary angle of research if you start with a problem in the world that interests you. It's very unlikely that it would be unlocked by one discipline rather than another. And so you start reading about it and you figure out who does what and what's the history of this problem and how does it look, let's call it sociologically, what's going on in society today, is there an economic dimension to it, and so forth, just to try to get a 360 sense of the space within which the thing that I was interested in unpacking situated itself. And so I saw myself in all those projects as a consumer of literatures from other fields. So what does a historian have to say about this? What does a sociologist have to say? What does a journalist have to say? And then I thought the next step was, let me go and see how it feels to really be there. And so I've been quite privileged in my career to be able, when I was studying war, to go embed myself with the military and see how that looked. When I was studying human rights, to go and be a human rights trainer and participate in various human rights missions around the world, to just get us, what does the table look like? How do these people do it? What seems to work? When do I, and look at myself too. How am I feeling this is working, this is not working? And then I thought, well, wait a second, I'm a law guy, so what does law have to do with it? And one of the things that's been interesting, I'm sure everybody promotes their own field as the core of everything, but it turns out actually law is the field that is the core of everything. And so underneath every one of these phenomena in the world that I thought were worth exploring, you could find that everything people was talking about was somehow situated on a legal structure. It wasn't just that law regulated it or was a tool for achieving it, but even before you got to regulating war, or even before you got to using law as a tool in warfare, all the different things you have to do to get a war to happen rested on some legal structure. You have to mobilize troops, you have to figure out where the territorial boundary is, you have to supply them with hamburgers wherever they are through a commercial value chain, you have to have a chain of command, you have to discipline the troops in the field, all that stuff. And every one of those things turns out to be, in one or another way, successfully or unsuccessfully, legally put together. And so I guess the common red thread of all of the things that I've looked at has been this effort to find the legal underlying structure beneath war, beneath economic development, as a red thread that would help unpack how it was assembled. It's a conversation, so you could say something. But I would say one more thing before you say something, which is, if you think about law in that way, you end up avoiding naturalizing things that might seem like physical facts in the world. So you might think, people talk about market forces as if they were like a tsunami. Then came the market forces and created something to happen in the world. But if you start thinking about the legal structure of a market force, you find all the things that an economist looks at, debt, credit, money, and so forth, turns out to have a legal undergirding in property or contract or something like that. And that means it could be put together in different ways. So if you're looking at the legal part of it, you're trying to figure out, there were choices there. And maybe law is a red thread to unpack what the choices were in putting a war machine together, or putting a humanitarian practice together, or putting a economic arrangement together that would then help you think about it differently. Okay, you can talk now.
So this definition of law, or this lens through which you're foregrounding these legal background rules and these structures, necessitate a very particular understanding of how do you define law. And here maybe we're confronted with a more conventional, narrow, wrongly defined legal field that usually when you talk about law, most people will think about regulation, something. So how do you contrast that very vast understanding of what you just described the law does and unfolding all these things with the more traditional, conventional, mainstream, narrow way to think about law?
Well, I mean, every field gets stuck in its own tracks and thinks about, economists think about the economy the way economists of their generation do, which might be different from another generation or another field. Historians think about history the way historians do in that period of time. It's a time when history is all about national things, and it's a global history period. So every discipline has these tracks that it runs in, and law is no exception to that. It is common for many people, often outside law, to imagine that law is primarily a tool for accomplishing things that's created by the government, that's systematic, that's relatively formalized, and that operates the way it says it operates. So if you have an anti-corruption project and you have an anti-corruption statute and an anti-corruption administration and they're doing anti-corruption, you assume that it's anti-corruption, not that it's a new site for corruption. But it turns out, actually, sometimes it is a new site for corruption. And sometimes it doesn't really stop corruption, but finds a way of keeping it going. And so in order to have an understanding of what law does in society, you need to relax a little bit those assumptions. And also it turns out, if you're thinking about law regulating war, or regulating poverty, or solving the problem of inequality, you'll focus on the efforts governments make to do those things. But you tend not to look at the way those things got constructed in the first place. How did it become a problem? Well, law was also how it became a problem sometimes. And so that aspect of law gets understudied in thinking about law only as a problem-solving governmental tool. I mean, let me give you an example from my own field of international law. If you look at an international law textbook, there's always a chapter on international environmental law. And everything in the chapter is about a treaty to protect the environment and an effort to have principles, the precautionary principle and so on, to protect the environment. There's nothing in the chapter about how law helps those who want to mess with the environment. But anybody who's ever destroyed an environment knows that law is their friend. So law gives you a sovereign entitlement to burn down your forest if you want to. Law gives a property holder the right to use property in ways that can be very antithetical to a regulatory approach to protect the environment, and so on. So if you start looking at law in the background of things, you often find that law is as much a part of the problem as part of the solution. And it seems to me that opens up broader avenues to do something about it. Like all of a sudden, new sites of contestation and new places for reform jump into view that might not have been visible had you looked at law in a more conventional way.
So is that sort of the idea of law also being like the site of struggle? So there's always the struggle in what the law becomes, but also how the law regulates or doesn't, and how you...
So there was this book I wrote some years ago called World of Struggle, which is maybe where you got the word struggle, although maybe you got it when you were a child and you were struggling, I don't know. But I think people, it's funny, in lots of the social sciences, the models start with the idea of struggle, balance of power struggle, great power struggle, economic competitive struggle, and then they figure out how to make you experience it as nevertheless orderly, somehow sorted out. So it's the projects to show how there are patterns of repetitive stability, even in all the struggle. And I've always tried to work in the other direction, to try to illuminate the extent to which our world still and always has ongoing struggles about things, which also means things aren't as settled as we might think they are, and there are more opportunities for change than we might anticipate there to be. And there's more room in most of the vocabularies of leadership and governance for differences of opinion than we might think. So if you go into a discussion, so when I was working in Brussels, you'd go into a discussion and everybody in the room would already have an idea that the range of discussion was very narrow about whatever it was that we were talking about. But there would be a possibility of finding, without a revolutionary attack on the barricades, that there were other possibilities within the framework of discussion that you could have brought to the table if people hadn't gotten so narrowed in the conversations that they were having. And very often, those narrowings simply reflected a struggle that had been won by somebody who now had hegemonic power over the field. And so, okay, if I take the consensus and I reinterpret a consensus as a win for somebody and a lose for other people, that makes me think about it in a different way. I don't think about the existing consensus as best practice. I think about the existing consensus as a winner's game. And I ask, well, who lost for that? What happened to those people? Where are they? What were their points of view? Let me go and try to put my hand on that somehow, sociologically, historically, rhetorically, and figure out whether there was something there that offers a promising avenue.
Great, so that leads me into the next thing that I wanted to discuss with you, because despite the fact that the common thread in most of your work is trying to foreground law, you've done a lot of work that's extremely interdisciplinary. So to what extent does this lens, looking at these different unfoldings through law, still allow you to do that interdisciplinary work? So you've done a lot of work with sociology, with history. You're known as a historian of international law and international affairs. How does that square in with still looking at these different subjects through that lens of law?
Everybody talks about interdisciplinarity and nobody really does it. I mean, there's that phenomenon. And I don't claim that what I've done is interdisciplinary in the sense of being a master of other disciplines. Rather, I've thought within my own field, it's hard for me to make sense of law without understanding how it operates in society, how it's operated historically, how it's participated in economic and political life and in structuring the domains of economy and polity. And if you start being interested in those things, then you have to figure out something about those other spheres. So part of interdisciplinarity is being an avid consumer of other literatures that might illuminate what it is you want to get at. And then it turns out they never talk about law in a very interesting way. So, you know, they go on and on and on, and you think, okay, where's the law? Where's the law? And then I think, oh no, that's my job. So I need to bring to the stories people are having about war, let's say, in political science, in military science, in military history, I need to be the guy who says, did law have something to do with that I can uncover and make a contribution? And maybe the way they thought it had to be wasn't the way that it had to be if the legal dimension could have been organized differently. So there, I guess it's more like a dialogue between me and the literatures that, even for reasons that are obscure, never pay enough attention to my own wonderful field. just as people in my field often pay very little attention to them. So, you got to break that down in your own research somehow. You have a problem in society you want to look at. You have to ask, what does my discipline give me as tools to look at it? And really deepen your understanding of that and get really good. But at the same time, you need to say, what does it leave out? What is it missing about the overall story of society? Because my problem isn't going to be just a legal problem. It's going to be also a social problem, a political problem. It's going to be a problem in history. And then you have to, go become an amateur and a consumer of these other things and try to bring them into your story. So anyway, that's how I've thought about it. I know people have more scientific ideas about it, but I'm pretty amateurish in my methodologies.
So why so a lot of your work is historical. So why have you taken mainly, or to a large extent, a historical approach to some of the work that you've done?
Well, first of all, every discipline I've ever encountered, every expert vocabulary comes with a historical story baked into it. So if you think about development economics, it has baked into it a certain idea about what development is that's modeled more or less firmly on the Industrial Revolution. So there was this time of a kind of stable equilibrium, nothing was happening, and then there was this moment at which suddenly there was a lot of economic growth and activity associated with the Industrial Revolution, and that was development. So now the question is, how is a society supposed to be able to get that to happen? And that's one historical story. There's another whole historical story now about how the developmental states of the post-war period ran amok. And everything they did needed to be turned on its head in order to have not state industrial policy, but free markets, open pricing, and so forth. Then there's a whole historical story about how, look what happened to Russia and it collapsed, and so now we need to do the opposite of that. And the historical thing we need to look at is how China succeeded, or how the East Asian tiger succeeded knowing that they didn't succeed with open markets, but with something else. So reference points in history often form the ground on which a field that thinks of itself as economics actually takes place. And then they study things related to those things they've defined as what needs to now be figured out. And so the first thing I tried to do in encountering a field like development economics is revisit its history of itself and try to figure out, is that right? What is left out? What is not left out? What is empowered? So one of the things, if you look at the post-war period, for example, it was astonishing the level of social transformation that development economists proposed could be accomplished in newly independent societies. So it's quite amazing. I mean, I used to teach a class on Mondays about human rights and on Wednesdays about economic development. And in the human rights class, we would often be the same students. And in the human rights class, I'd say, well, you're going to really change these societies and these cultures, so you're going to change the way they treat gender relations. And, well, I'm not really sure, and culture is really important. And so there was a kind of queasiness about coming from the outside with a bunch of recipes and changing a society just because you think women should have a better stake in things when, maybe that's not what they think they are, or whatever. Then you go Wednesday, you get to the economic development class, and suddenly the same students are talking about, well, we're going to move all the peasants to the city, and we're going to move, we're going to break down the agriculture, we're going to replace it with industry, and we're going to have immigration, and we're going to build factories, and we're going to have, it's like, whoa, we're going to electrify the villages, and suddenly they're talking about dramatic transformations in order to achieve industrialization, in order to put people into factories because they had an image from the Industrial Revolution about what that meant. Replace artisanal craft with fabrications in factories. So de-skill people in some ways, re-skill them in other ways, concentrate them in new kinds of workplaces, educate them in a different way, transform their family life. Wow. So it makes human rights seem ridiculously small scale, right? Why did they have that idea? Well, often they had that idea because they had a historical picture that they were trying to reproduce. And that left open the question, how did that happen the first time around? So the Industrial Revolution turns out not to have happened by a bunch of people from the World Bank arriving in Great Britain in 1780 and figuring out how the entire society could be transformed through governmental action. It was a much more open, complex process of social development and so on. And so that a historical understanding might have led one to think, do you think this can really be done in 10 years in a society that just became independent with a government that's just getting on its feet? And you might think, no way. So the historical, unpacking the historical story and trying to figure out how it was helping to cabin the imagination of people who were involved in doing something turned out to be an illuminating way of finding the limitations in what was a dominant vocabulary of policy and politics for a relatively long time. I'll give you another example. So in the field of international law, it's a common, so international lawyers all learn a very simple history, which is that it all started in 1648 in Westphalia, which turns out to be in Germany, where they have Ham. And in Westphalia, the state system was inaugurated, which has been the foundational political structure until now, and then law is built on top of that. So the state system is real, it's political, it's historical, and law is a relatively recent artificial creation on top of it. And that's the way it is. Now that story creates all kinds of ideas that seem a little bit crazy. Like in this story, nothing happened between 1648 and World War I other than the slow working out of ideas. If you get an international law textbook, there's 1648, and then there's Grotius and Pufendorf and Flibbertigibbet and all these guys thinking about it, and then there's World War I. And then there's modernization in the 20th century in a variety of ways with institutions. So left out is, the state system started in 1648. Didn't we have empires? There's a thing about empire, I'm kind of forgetting, but weren't there empires in the 19th century and the 20th century? And do we have empires now? And what was going on in the Indian subcontinent in 1648 is completely forgotten in the situation. So, what was 1648 supposed to have done? Well, it was supposed to have gotten religion out of international affairs by determining a settlement in which every prince could have their own religion in their own place. Well, that happened as a sort of settlement in some places, kind of partially, but if you now say religion has no place in international affairs, you're excluding an awful lot of people who think an awful lot of religious ideas ought to have a lot of play in what goes on globally. So, in other words, a certain kind of historical narrative shrinks how international law imagines itself and imagines what it's been doing in history. So, if you think of the history of international law as the effort to regulate war, and there's definitely a long history of doctrines that are about regulating war, for sure, you're not going to think about war as a legal institution. But war is also, as I said, a legal institution. So where did that go? How did that get forgotten? Well, it partly got historically forgotten. It became just part of our understanding of the present, that wasn't what law had been built to do, was built on top, and so forth. Or another thing you get out of that is states are real and political, and anything else is artificial and legal. So you're a corporation, or you're an individual, or you're the UN, you could be significant and so forth, but the states are the real McCoy because of their organic political roots in history. Well, that's a very strange understanding of the balance of power in global society, where, first of all, most states are quite artificial and quite recent. and just sort of sitting on top of cultures that are quite different from the culture of rulership. And they don't look anything like France in its organic historical development. And corporations and, Elon Musk is much more powerful in global political affairs than most things that call themselves countries. So you have an incredibly distorted picture if you're operating with that map. Or everybody knows Israel is a state and everyone knows that Palestine is an entity, a legal creation. So that creates a whole set of agendas for all sorts of things. Is statehood the appropriate and only desired end for an emancipatory struggle? Was the post-colonial state a good idea? Was it even really a state? What about the economic arrangements of post-colonial global economy? Is that part of it? All that stuff somewhat goes off screen when you're focusing on a historical story focused on states as the organic political background. So I've always thought a historical inquiry opened the door to a critical inquiry about things we take for granted in our contemporary arrangement by trying to notice how created, how unusual, how partial they are.
Great, so I have two questions, but I'll start with one on interdisciplinarity, because everything you said was about trying to uncover these forgotten narratives, these historical accounts that are generally somehow pushed aside and forgotten. And to become a critical scholar, which is what I will ask you about next, is also to be able to engage with these other fields, whether it's history, sociology, or economics. How do you institutionalize that? So maybe this is relevant here in our context. How do you actually make this something that we can institutionalize and tap into, both as researchers, but students in social sciences? We always work in silos, independent of each other. How could there be a project to actually work at that institutionally?
Isn't that what you're doing? Maybe I should ask you that question. So,
I'm trying.
I mean, as I understand it, that's the Sciences Po kind of direction of travel, which I think is a really promising one. Well, I think there are small steps as part of graduate programs in many places, people who are being disciplined into a discipline, which is certainly what PhDs are about and maybe what they should be about. And is often what master's programs are about. You can have requirements, curricular requirements of a variety of kinds to put out a pontoon somewhere else and find out how your discipline looks from an adjacent discipline. Those kinds of things can be helpful sometimes. But I mean, I've also found in my own academic career that I've been enormously helped by being in a network of scholars who were interested in asking critical questions about our contemporary situation and were somehow in one or another way positioned in a different location. Maybe they were in a different location geographically. So not all people in the United States, which is where I work and what I know best, but people in strange foreign countries like France or Europe who might have a different angle on something, but also not just the North Atlantic. So how can we be in better conversation with voices outside the North Atlantic, or outside our own imperial, historical colonies? So, and that's hard. It's actually very difficult. It requires remaining in touch with people who you might have met early on in some academic space, and then staying in touch with them and finding a way that you're the only person who knows anybody in Ghana when the time comes to do some project, but you do know somebody in Ghana, and they're able to help you, and they're able to help because they also know somebody in Bangladesh, and they know, so who are working on the same kind of urban problem, and suddenly you're able to be in that kind of a conversation. And I think something similar disciplinarily, it's a matter of one or two colleagues. So when you're getting going, all you people getting going, find a friend who you really like and, go out to dinner with and, sleep with or something, and have them be in another discipline and stick with it. So stick with the conversation as you become disciplined and as they become disciplined, and try to find points of overlap, and then have them not just as a friend, but as a kind of colleague for life. So how does one find that small group of colleagues for life who are going to open your doorways and your windows and not close them down and not be part of intensifying your own discussion with your field? But I mean, that's just a matter of personal appetite in some way. Can I go back to the history question just for a second? Because I think, another piece of the puzzle for me is thinking about innovation and change. So when there's I've always been struck by folks thinking about the global situation and trying to figure out, is this a moment where lots of things need to be changed, or only a few things need to be changed? And very often you find that if we took a vote, how many people think lots of things need to be foundationally changed, and how many people think basically everything is going fine? Many times students will be at least 50-50, if not more, for actually we really do need to rethink foundational things. So, I would take a vote in the class. So let's do that. Do you guys want to do that for a second? Okay. How many people think, looking out at global affairs today, that it's really a moment like 1648 in which foundational rethinking is really an important project of your generation? And how many people think, no, it's not a moment like that. It's a moment that's seriously in need of some reforms and some doubling down on what we have and of better management, but foundational change is not really that necessary at this point if we could just get what we have and make it work. So, one, foundational change and rethinking is actually an important project of the generation. Okay, foundational change is not really that important, but really making what we have work better is the project of the generation. Okay, so now we have a topic. How can that be done? So if you look at the disciplines that are actually ongoing, you could think, well, I just got to Sciences Po, which is the discipline in foundational rethinking? Oh, none of them are doing that. They're all doing how things work. So I don't know what it's like here, but if you take a course, I teach international political economy, so I thought I'll look at the textbooks. So you look at the textbooks on international political economy, and they're all about how international political economy works. So here's how it works. Here's what the World Bank does, and here's what the IMF does, and here's what the trade system does, and here's what the EU does, and there you go, thanks, you can graduate now. Like, whoa, wait a minute. I was interested in foundational rethinking. There's not a chapter about that. So then you have to figure out, how am I going to get from being taught how things work, which is important to know, to trying to figure out how and the conditions for rethinking might be identified and how one might do something about them in some way in one's life or with one's friends or with that colleague for life that you just made. And there, I think history has been for me an important part of how to do that, because it's really hard to realize how recent everything that we now take for granted is. Was that grammatical? Somehow, I ended with two is's and it didn't sound right. So, in my lifetime, which is, now getting older, there has been a completely foundational reconfiguration of almost all the institutions of global political economy. So, they set up the IMF and they set up the World Bank and all those things to facilitate national industrial policy and so forth. And then they turn into agents of free trade over a course of about 15 years. They had corporations that were designed to be linked to territories and populations, and then they designed ways in which they weren't. So major institutions and their forms were transformed in small steps. Or it's really common in political science to treat the state system as if it had existed since 1648. But then you think, well, actually, most places weren't states, so how was politics organized? And states are not equivalent units. They're incredibly different. So the image that a state is a state is a state is a state really is a complete delusional mystification. I mean, I know at the UN they all have the same size flagpole, but that's really not realistic. So, okay, how much reimagining went on to get that to happen? So if you go back 100 years, 120, 30 years to the late 19th century, in just the field of law and international law, it's amazing how small a group of people worked to change the foundational ideas about international legal arrangements successfully. And we're able to take advantage of things like, oops, there was a world war, now we get to do something, we can shift a few things around. But they innovated all these things that you can do now. When there's some conflict somewhere, you can have minority protection and international responsibility and institutions, and all that stuff had to be thought up and had to be invented. They thought about law as a matter of rules, and then it turned out to not be about rules. It turned out to be about policies and principles, and then it wasn't about that. So if you go back into the history of your own field, the way you're being taught it now will turn out to be very recent in its consolidation. And then you can ask, okay, who won and who lost by making that the way things are understood to be? Were there other interpretations that got pushed to the side? Were there other things that field could have been about that got lost? Who is responsible and what group is responsible for this set of ideas being hegemonic once I've learned that it wasn't always hegemonic? And so I've often thought that that finding those moments of innovation can give you the sense all is not lost now. So it turns out not to be that hard to rethink things foundationally because people have been doing it every 20 years for a long time, and we just don't notice how what we could call a revolution of small changes in a relatively short lifespan can fundamentally reorganize how things are. And if that happens within relatively stable societies like ours, think how much more dramatic it is in societies that have been transformed and upended and shoved around and moved in 26 directions and just whipped back and forth by global forces that have legal structuring background of a variety of types. So their innovation and rethinking and foundational changes seems like something that is forced upon one rather than something one can do, but it's also something one can participate in interesting ways. So I think, in other words, the reason to do this interdisciplinary thing is to have pictures of change that you wouldn't see if you were taking only one discipline whose teachers and books are all organized around how everything works fine and how everything works normally and how difficulties are an anomaly which can be settled in some way by reform. All those ideas that are incredibly common turn out, in my view, to be mistaken. And you have to kind of unpick them.
So that leads perfectly into my next set of questions, which is in uncovering these moments of change and like tapping into that interdisciplinary plethora of alternatives. That's a form of critique, right? So you're known and and most of your work, you've been a critical scholar, and you've generally been critiquing the conventional wisdom of expertise, but also of the world as we understand it, and of these things that seems to be, everyone takes them for granted, but uncovering these other alternatives. So maybe a question is, how do you see yourself as a critical scholar? With what traditions were you engaging? And what are you critiquing and against whom? So.
Well, first of all, I think if you ask most scholars if they're critical, they'll say they are. That's the point, is to come up with something new that other people aren't doing. So, you know, in the institute that I run, we try to get people to think about their own work around 4 questions that I think are good no matter what kind of scholar you are, which is, what field or discipline are you intervening on? What have you found that's different from what other people have found? Why is that important? And what's now open for discussion that might not have been open before? So if you can answer those 4 questions, doesn't matter, you could be critical or not critical, but you wouldn't be doing scholarship if you were not intervening in some field because you had found something that other people had not found, that you thought was important, and that you thought opened up new avenues of exploration. So when somebody asks you about your paper, you know, that's the elevator speech. I'm intervening in this thing, this is what I found, it's really important, and it makes me think we need to study this more than we have studied it in the past. So in that sense, I don't think being critical is a particularly special kind of thing. On the other hand, sometimes it is. So it's true that everybody says about me who knows anything about me that I'm really critical. So watch out, I'm very critical. And mean-spirited. And what does that actually mean? So I think there, for me, a critical orientation to intellectual work arises from some passion, animus, anger about something. So when I've had students who I thought were really poised to do interesting foundational rethinking, which is what I'm in favor of too, I would have voted with the foundational rethinking people, usually they come at something with a ferocious sense that something's wrong. So that could be the result of an experience. They worked in the summer at some NGO or some government that they thought would be part of the solution, and they got disillusioned. They had a kind of kiss and tell experience that I went thinking this was going to be about solving this problem, and you won't believe it, it was terrible or whatever. Or I remember, so this often happens to people from peripheral parts of Europe. The European peripheries, they go to Brussels thinking the EU is the answer to their problem, and then they get there and get treated like second-class citizens from the periphery, and then they get really angry. And then they want to do something critical about Europe because they realize it's part of the problem, not part of the solution. So that kind of thing gets you going in some way. And I've always had that as a result of some kind of political sense that my elders had it wrong and were messing things up. So I was a typical kid of the late Vietnam War, and I thought the best and the brightest elites of my country were committing heinous, disastrous, amoral impositions on innocent people in foreign countries. And I thought that was bad, and I was really interested in how could they think that makes sense to do? How is it possible that, you know, perfectly nice people could have gotten themselves into the position of bombing innocent civilians somewhere for some reason and almost all of the wars of my lifetime have turned out to be really stupid and catastrophic. So okay, I was angry about that, and I thought, now there's something to understand. I come at a problem with the sense that the elites, and you know, that's what I'm going to study, found a way of thinking this was reasonable. So they didn't think I'm a diabolically amoral person, I think I'll go bomb some people. They did not have that idea. They often had the idea that what they were doing was very tightly connected with something humanitarian, if not, or something that was legitimate, or something that was worthy, something that was almost noble. And so, okay, now there's something to study here, which is a whole class of people who are doing a thing that I think is completely wrong. And they have a whole sense of right and wrong, and they're working on it, and they have many good arguments, and so I wanted to try to figure that out. So in other words, I think the critical thing comes first from that. And so, that's different now, because the war thing, there's war back on the table, but it seems, repeating itself over and over. But there are also a lot of other things. So you could say the condominium of power of the left and the right in the leading societies of the North Atlantic over the last generation has systematically screwed up and not noticed. So the economy, the relationship with the rest of the world, they just made one catastrophic set of miscalculations, always thinking that it was the only thing and the best practice and so forth. So you get to foundational rethinking being necessary if you have some animus against the people older than you, or in my case now younger than me, who are running things using the best science and the best knowledge and the most careful practice, and nevertheless doing things that you find really inappropriate. And so you have something you want to investigate. So I guess that's the thing. Then it seems to me step 2 is you have to get an intuition about why that is, how that happened. So one intuition might be something about this. They've taken a set of facts about the situation to be foundational, not realizing how artificial they are and how they could be changed. So that we talked about a minute ago, right? The elite's problem is that they think there is such a thing as a market and it has to be like that, and all they can do is manage it in some way rather than trying to transform it. Not realizing that they could transform it and that it has been transformed and that there are ways in which you could have a market that would just be set up really differently. So that's one kind of intuition. Another kind of intuition would be everybody in these fields focuses on equality as being the normal thing and inequality as aberrational. So in economic life or in trade, the picture is a bargained for exchange between a buyer and a seller, where normally they're operating under conditions of relative equality unless it's abnormal because there's a monopoly, or in one or another way there's some sort of inequality of bargaining power that needs to be rectified. But the normal situation, if you could get the glitches out, is one in which parties bargain basically equally. Well, I've always thought that's not right. That the basic situation in every bargain is a power bargain, in which the bargain will result from the relative power between the players. And how much power they have is often a matter of what law entitles them to do. So, in fact, the normal situation is a situation that has power and hierarchy already part of it. Not just when there's a monopoly, but all the time. And so if you think, I want to put hierarchy at the center of my understanding of economic life, rather than an equality of bargaining, you have an intuition about how the mainstream way of thinking about things has not noticed the problem of inequality except when it gets out of bounds in some way. Or you could think, let's go back to all those flags at the UN. You could imagine diplomacy is a game of equal states bargaining with each other in some way normally, unless there's some kind of glitch, like one party is way too powerful and is being imperial and so on and so forth. And so you could imagine, and if you go to the UN or diplomatic circles, all these people are running around saying to each other, Your Excellency, Your Excellency. They're all excellent, and they all are, equal status, and they sit at the table in the same chairs and whatever. And somehow you're not noticing the unbelievable centrality of hierarchy between the people that generate norms and those that receive norms. You're imagining that every country is sovereign over its own territory, not noticing that most countries accept most of their regulation from somewhere else, or are governed by corporations, not by their own government, or something like that. You're not noticing the north-south dynamic. So if you said, I want to retell everything about international diplomacy and politics, putting hierarchy at the center of the story rather than equality at the center of the story. So that's an intuition. And my intuition is that the elites are messing up because they're under-noticing power dynamics and over-believing that there's a kind of equality in the situation. So then you can go and try to figure out how that happened and how that could be changed and so forth. So for me, the critical inquiry is, you got to be angry about something, or else why do it? You have to want there to be change of some kind that's not being undertaken by the people who are already in charge. But then you have to figure out, why aren't they doing that? What is it that's holding them back? What is it that's getting in the way? Where are the possibilities to unpick that? And that's why I feel that examining how they think, how they have learned to understand the situation, and where, to bring law back into the story, underneath it all, a legal change might change things that they're not noticing. You might find something where you could really make foundational change, and you could identify a place that it was worth fighting over in some way.
So I want to follow up on one thing you just said about constructing these normal situations that in and of themselves embody that power and hierarchy. And a lot of these constructed norms and situations of what we consider normal are also constructed within a global north, Western kind of sphere. And you were at the beginning of many critical movements. One of them was TWAIL, so third world approaches to international law. So maybe to link it with what you were just saying, to what extent was that also a movement that started, given the points that you just told us, what drives critique and what's the relationship between that kind of work and the critical work that you're engaged in?
Well, I mean, I'm just a consumer of critical literatures. So, and if you have a kind of animus to rethink things, if you want to try to investigate how the elites have run amok, how their thinking is limited, even though they seem to have taken everything into account. They all say they've taken everything into account, but you can see they have not taken everything into account, obviously. So how do you're not starting from scratch. There are lots of literatures out there by people who have tried to do the sort of thing that I'm encouraging people to do before, and I've been kind of cannibalistic about it. So trying to see what tools of inquiry can I get out of reading, structural historical models of domination. So, they're not, I don't think they're right always, but it's interesting. Find somebody who, has a world system theory about how the center constantly dominates the periphery and develops a whole theory about it that has a little bit of law there. I think, well, I don't know if I really buy that completely, but it gives me an idea of something to look for. Maybe I can use that to try to generally think about a core periphery model and apply that in international law. Do I see things in international law I wouldn't see otherwise? Or, now I'm trying to figure out how the elites get so stuck. Well, there are psychological models of people getting stuck. So maybe there's some psychology that I could read that would help me understand how people normalize situations that are really catastrophic, what people's reactions are, how elites form and constantly re-encourage each other in their kind of common projects, and figure out how I can learn there. I'm not exactly sure it's everybody's id that's driving their ego or whatever, so I don't know, but it's useful. So I read a little Freud, whatever. So and I encourage people to get like any 6 books of social theory that are hard books, like by big famous names, Marx, Hegel, whatever, Simone de Beauvoir, and sit them, next to your toilet and read a paragraph here and there and see whether it gives you an idea about something that you're studying in a regular course. And I bet you that just a paragraph will give you an idea. So you don't have to go and become, read all 400,000 volumes of whoever. in order to be informed by people you know have the reputation for being foundational rethinkers, in generation after generation of different feminist voices. And they all disagreed with each other, and each generation tried to change what the generation before said, and so forth. And they all had a variety of different ideas of what feminism would or wouldn't be, or gender justice was. Fine. They're all interesting examples of people really trying to have a significant foundational critique. So let me read them and see what I can learn for things I'm criticizing. And I think intellectual voices from the global South, from the earliest moment of post-colonial or pre-colonial literatures of resistance, are also very interesting in that way. That is, there were people in Pan-African literature and so forth who were seeing us and not liking us and having an interpretation of us, and that's really helpful and has been very instructive to me. Sort of, okay, they, in different ways, each generation has had a different idea of what they're trying to do. There are like 8 different Pan-African projects that, had different relations to the post-colonial state as a project, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not like finding the right one. It's just enriching oneself with the idea that there are critical approaches out there who are trying to unpack the hegemonic views of the leading disciplines that are managing the world as they see it. And if that's our project or your project in part, then you can learn from them in some way. So that would be how I would think about that. It's a kind of cannibalism of critical thinking so that you realize you're not starting on your own. And for me, it was really important to do that with a few friends, to say, okay, here I am in law school and everybody's explaining to me how the legal system works and I want to understand how it doesn't work. So let me find 3 or 4 friends and read some things and try to make sense of them and see whether or not we can see whether that adds a dimension to what I'm learning in my class about tax or whatever. And sometimes it really did. And I think if I move forward, I've been, again, very fortunate that in my own field, I've been doing this in a period when scholars who came at the field with either a feminist or a largely third worldist, I had different words for it at different times, perspective, have come banging on the door and trying to figure out how the field has systematically disregarded their priorities and concerns and come up with a variety of different ideas about it. And it's been fascinating to participate, learn from, engage with those people, but also to try to make my own contributions to those literatures, but also to see how they have themselves changed their views. So, if we think of, there is this movement of people in international law called Third World Approaches to International Law that got started in the early 1990s, and now it's become a thing like critical race theory that you can object to and disparage, so maybe it succeeded in that sense. But every generation that's come along has thought that people just before them didn't get it right. So it turns out third world approaches to international law is a changing target and topic. So there was a generation, to simplify it, that thought the goal was statehood and participation, and let's get into the UN, and let's go there and change everything. Let's get our judges onto the World Court. Let's get our diplomats into Geneva, and so forth. And then there was a generation that thought, okay, I can see the limitations of that. That's really not the right way to go, and saw those people as complicit, ultimately. It wasn't just that they made a mistake, it was that they were part of the problem of reinforcing the post-colonial state as the vehicle of emancipation and participating in a post-colonial economic order that was disadvantageous and even whatever became neoliberal later and so on. Okay, so that generation had a whole other idea about what to do. Now they're also coming into critique, criticism for the ways in which they put things together and their lack of attention to other kinds of issues, be they feminist issues or issues of indigeneity. And so, in other words, I see this critical project of foundational rethinking as one that gets its energy from understanding itself as a constant effort of revisiting. And it's not like all of you foundational thinkers, when you guys finish, then we'll have figured out the foundations so we don't need to worry about it anymore. Everything that you figure out and put into the foundations will turn out to have unexpected bad consequences, and then the next group of people will have to foundationally rethink them too. And so the question, as you guys become us guys, is how are you going to help the next generation of people foundationally unthink what you think, and try to keep that openness of the system to being not a system, but a site where you can struggle over the foundation somehow alive. So, I mean, I think that it's a human ongoing project. It's not a looking for the answer kind of project.
So one more question on critique, because so much critical work is rooted in identity and identity politics, but that does not seem to be at all the approach you are taking. Whether it's anti-colonial or else, you don't necessarily, you look beyond identity or after identity. So I would like to ask you a bit about that, and how do you position your critique versus critique that is identity-based?
Well, I mean, I'm not against identity. So I have an identity, you know. Everybody does in some way, or comes to understand that they might, or more than one or something. And for many people, the critical animus comes from their own understanding of their identity and their situation. So I think it's an important and powerful source of creative reimagination. That would be the first thing to say. I mean, the story of generational change is a story of identity, the identity of a common experience of a generation. So if I had done that vote that I just did in 1992, it would have been 80% for doubling down on what we already have and making it work in the immediate aftermath of what we thought was the end of the Cold War. So you guys are in a situation, you're in a particular generational situation, it's part of your identity in which you voted 80-20, that it's a big generational project to think that the foundations of the arrangements at the world are open and should be critiqued and rethought. So that makes you and your identity different from generations at another moment. So the first thing I would say is that's an important aspect of knowing who one is and why one is doing intellectual work and why you're studying and why you're learning what you're learning. It has to do with who you are in some way. The second thing I would say about it is, I mean, if you think, as I do, that an important piece of the puzzle is how the situation in the world has become hierarchical in ways that I think are disagreeable. Positionality is an important part of critique too. You want to know who you're in favor of. So, I mean, society is made up of groups of some kind. You know, you could think they're classes, you could think they're genders, you could think they're national groups, you could think they're cultures, I don't know, whatever you think they are. And I think it's completely weird that people write as if what they were writing was, of course, in the interests of everybody. So I'm writing about how the international law should be made differently in the interests of everybody, which is so crazy. Nothing is in the interest of everybody. Everything has winners and losers. And so one needs to figure out who are the people one wants to be winners and who are the people one wants to be losers. So if you think the elites have had it too good, then they're the losers that are in your target, and you want to figure out, you think women have had it worse than men, and women are who you're for, and men are going to be losers. So I think that willingness in the exercise of power to be for somebody and against somebody, to be distributional in how one thinks about things, is an important part of just knowing what politics is and what intellectual work is. You're not engaging in political life, you're not engaging in critical thinking unless you're open to the idea that what you're doing is going to have consequences. That's why you're doing it. And the consequences are going to be good for some people and bad for some people. And you can try to talk everybody into how your values are actually universal. All empires do that. And, of course, it does, parents do that too. This is all for your own good, darling, that you have to go to bed now. So everybody says how what you have to do is good for them. But in fact, of course, it's not always. So I think identity in the form of positionality and knowing that you're for somebody and that you're willing to accept the cost of other people bearing the cost of that. You may want to make them less costly, but you're not going to, your answer is, the thing you're coming up with is not going to have no losers. I mean, I say something about human rights here, so I'll get back to identity in a minute. I know none of this is what you wanted me to say. So, but I'll get to what you want me to say in a moment. So there was this moment when human rights was a big deal. I don't know, I think we're sort of past that now, but human rights was like the big thing everybody wanted to do. And I wrote an article and eventually a book that had the theme, human rights, part of the problem. Is human rights in one or another way part of what's making the world worse as much or more than it's making it better? Let me try to unpick this as a humanitarian venture in some way. And one of the things that I thought was troublesome about human rights is that they were imagined to be cost-free. So there was always some sense in human rights advocacy that, you could have better human rights protection, and that would be good, right? But then if you said, well, what's the cost of that? It was very hard for people to talk about that too much. So, for example, I got involved with a project with some people in Britain to end the death penalty in various places in the Caribbean that had referred at that time in their high court procedure to Britain for resolution of different things, and they were trying to abolish the death penalty. And as a human right, so that was their idea. The human rights vocabulary would be legalized to get rid of the death penalty. I'm against the death penalty. I think it's an absurd and travesty of state action, although states kill people all the time in lots of other ways by what they permit to be done. But leaving that aside for a second and just focusing on that, it's not my top priority, but yeah, I'd be for abolishing it. But then I would say, if you abolish the death penalty on this particular country, what are the costs of that? Are people going to be incarcerated without parole for longer, under worse circumstances? What is likely to actually happen in the criminal justice system of the place? What about the people who feel that their wound, the victims of crime who feel that their wound can't be salved without the death of the perpetrator? Are they just supposed to get talked out of that? Are you providing them with therapy? Or how are you helping them cope with the ongoing living person who killed their mother? What are you doing about that person who will be a loser? Now, I'm happy to have that person be a loser because I'm against the death penalty, but how are we thinking about that? How do we put these different costs onto the story of eliminating the death penalty? And so if you generalize that and you say, when I'm doing a good thing, I really have to think about who's paying the costs. And you might say, so they should. But at least you're thinking about that in some way, and that's in some way also a kind of identity question about yourself. Okay, now you wanted me to talk about identity in some other way. In what way did you want me to talk about it?
Identity-based critique and how your work isn't necessarily identity-based critique, but I think it's obvious with the explanation you gave about positionality versus identity.
Yeah, I think so. I think that people finding and expressing and being part of an identity is the kind of thing that it's relatively recent. So we have to say interpreting positionality as identity is something that didn't exist in the 60s. So it was in the same way, so of the last century. So it's something that's relatively recent, that people come into agency by inhabiting an identity, and only some things get to be identities. So not everything gets to be an identity, and you can struggle to have your thing be an identity, and so forth. And then you can have an idea about how significant it is, and so forth. And that, in my view, that has been remarkably important for lots of emancipatory movements, but it's also had some dead ends around it. And so I think I've been somebody who's approached this with a kind of skeptical eye from the beginning, that it can lead one to double down on one particular aspect of oneself rather than on many ways in which one's connected to all kinds of other people. It can lead to the idea of zero-sum kinds of solutions because one identity wins and another loses. It can become a little rigid in what goes with the identity and what doesn't go with the identity. So, I think there are ways in which, it can become too associated with mutual respect and not with distributional questions. So it's about dignity rather than, which I'm in favor of dignity as much as the next guy, but I'm also in favor of distributional arrangements that are more equal than those we have. So if I had to choose between a focus on dignitary insults and material or ideational, distributional things, I would focus on the distributional, ideational things. I think they're more important, to people at the bottom of our societies who may be only able to get things by claiming an identity, but it would be really interesting if that wasn't the only path. I worry about the people who don't have an identity. So everybody who has an identity leaves other people outside their identity, and there's going to be a remnant of people who are kind of left out of the whole game of identity. And I worry about those people because I suppose they have an identity as not an identity, and that must really suck. So I think in all those ways, I approach it with a grain of salt, let's put it that way. And I want to try to, and I've tried to encourage people who have emancipatory projects to share that grain of salt, and to try to manage a relationship with identity formation and identity as a significant aspect of our current situation without getting too tied up in it. I don't know, that's just my identity. But that's what I think about that. I think we can really, progressive people can get led really off track if we take identity as the only or main thing and we take it too rigidly, and so forth.
Great, so I'll move to another set of questions, maybe one or two before we open up to your questions, and that sort of brings the two discussions that we've been having on law and interdisciplinarity together with critique under the banner of political economy. So political economy as a movement has now been gaining traction in the US, understood as somehow a movement that has been seeking to unearth these relationships between law and economics, politics, focusing on the legal structure and somehow the rise of neoliberalism and its entrenchment and how to critique it, perpetuating inequality and so on. And you've done a lot of work and you've been teaching law and political economy, and I would like to ask you a little bit about that and what you think of the movement, what you think about your work and relationship to the movement, what they've been doing at LPE, and what other forms as a form of critique, but also as a form of, or a lens to understand some of these challenges that we can look through to talk about distribution and all the things that you care about.
So it's actually quite interesting that in the last, half a dozen years, the phrase political economy has had a revival in my country. I don't know what it's like in France or in French, but if you said political economy, 10 years ago, what? It wouldn't really be a thing. So, and maybe this had to do with, I don't know if you guys were born yet, but in 2009 there was a big economic crisis, and after that, then there was trying to figure out what went wrong, and maybe it had something to do with politics and something to do with economics. So I can tell you a little report from my own country, what do the words law and political economy seem to mean? So you could think there's a tradition of political economic, back to the classical economists of Marx and so forth, and Ricardo and all that. It has nothing to do with that. So these people using political economy have only a passing familiarity with the idea that anybody used these words before. I think, so partly, if you're interested in political economy, it signals that you're kind of on the left, you're progressive. It signals that you think that the economy should be regulated more than it is, so a kind of soft center-left position. It signals that you think economic life has political dimensions in the way of, in early feminism, the personal is political, the economy is political. It was more like a slogan in the way that then needed to be worked out. Political in what sense? And what do we mean by political and so forth? It doesn't seem to be the case that it means the political is economic. It seems to be that the thing is the economy that needs to be political. And then what does law have to do with it? Well, it's a little bit of an afterthought, or maybe it's what makes it that way, or it's what politics could use to regulate the economy. In other words, it's a slogan that's been reanimated as part of the reanimation of a regulatory agenda for a national government. And I mean, I'm all for that. That sounds good. I, vote for the Democratic Party when I need to, if that's the only thing on offer. But I think that it's had some, as a movement, it's had some unfortunate, so far, limitations. So, like any elite discussion, so this is a attractive center-left discussion among elites who are trying to put politics and economics into the same terrain. So now, I'm all for that, but what are their limitations? So, well, you could start asking, how do they imagine society? What do they think of as the society within which and for which there's a political economy? What's their social picture? The first thing to say is they think about a society as a nation. So it's the national economy and the national political arrangements. So, and how do they think about a national economy? Well, it's the economy of the United States managed by the institutions of the United States and so forth. And what is the political? It's the American government. I don't know if they have this in France, where you imagine, when you're imagining political economy, you're imagining the French state and the French economy. Maybe you guys are more Euro than that. But that's a completely limited way of thinking about both the political and the economic. So the economics is a global thing, and it's also an intrinsically local thing. So the very precise local economies that are understood and lived in by people in very different places within the United States, and the differences between the leading sectors and the lagging sectors are harder to get at if you're thinking about a national economy. Likewise, the relationship between a world set of economic activities and things that happen in the United States are harder to see. And then if you're thinking about the political as the things the government does, you're missing a lot of what's political, like the politics of the family, the politics of the location, the politics of market actors, the politics of corporate life, internal corporate life, the politics of private law as well as public law in the legal field. So that immediately in the guise of opening up a whole new terrain of investigation, you have to be alert to whether or not it's also closing it out in some way, or making it a kind of too limited terrain of investigation to think that they're really going to get at something foundational. So it seems like it's an invitation to think about politics as a much more diverse thing that happens at the local level, and the regional level, the global level, in the family, outside the family, and to think about economic life as something that happens in the household and in the society and so forth. and to try to put those things into the same picture. And then I think it could be quite productive. It'd be a very interesting thing to do. So, in other words, I think these kind of, one has to take advantage of these moments. All of a sudden, there's in intellectual life a space in which you can ask questions you couldn't ask 10 years ago, in which you can investigate things and say, oh, well, I'm doing political economy. And everybody go, ooh, that's very good. That sounds great. You must be sort of a, progressive person. But actually, okay, good, that's step one. But now, how do I do that in a way that is encouraging of foundational rethinking, that's encouraging of a bigger picture that comes at, let's say, the US economy, thinking of it as a developing country, thinking of our government as dysfunctional in the way that many governments are dysfunctional. So if we started thinking the United States is Brazil, now how do we think about Brazil? Oh my God, it's terrible, we're really unequal, the governments are, okay, now bring that back to the United States. And what would it mean to interpret the United States that way? You'd see a lot of things you wouldn't otherwise see. And so in other words, it's finding a way to take the opening and then twist it a little bit to make other kinds of power dynamics more visible than they might otherwise be. And then I guess I would say another piece of that would be the law and political economy people tend to view law as a kind of problem-solving thing on the one hand and an ideological formation on the other. So law has been the carrier of neoliberal ideology into practice would be the kind of thing one would hear a political economy person say. And I think that's true, but we'd have to figure out what that means exactly and what kind of policies and how that really happened. But there's still a focus on the idea that law through the government regulating things could reverse that, and partly they could, and that's good. But partly it's not noticing, again, the understructure of law that made all that in some way possible. So, if you think the Constitution constitutes public life in America and is a good map of power, you really don't understand power. I mean, in the Constitution, they don't even mention corporations. So that you just do not understand power if your legal picture of it is what's constituted by the Constitution. And we have 3 branches, the judiciary and the administration. And we've got about 20 branches. We've got citizens groups, we have corporations, we have Elon Musk, we have foreigners, we have Europe. They're all part of the power dynamic. And so they're all legally part of the power dynamic. And we should rethink our Constitution with that in mind.
Great. So I think I'll stop here so that we can get some questions from the audience in. So, so feel free to ask your questions in French or in English. We would both struggle a bit. Okay. Okay, so I see 3 on that side. Where?
Thank you so much for speaking with us. My name is Charlotte Ward. Hello. Thank you so much for talking with us. It was very interesting. So I would argue that politics is the most important foundation of our society because I'm at Sciences Po. And on that basis, I've also really thought about the issue with states and how weird the concept of state is and this hierarchy and the fact that this model is maybe not adapted to the modern global challenges we're facing today. But I don't really see a solution. I mean, all the alternatives we have their own problems. I mean, I was thinking about anarchism, but obviously it has its own issues. And so I was wondering, I mean, I'm sure you didn't mention explicitly any theory because you want us to make our own path, but if you could hint us towards maybe something, a model or a school of thought that you find to be maybe an answer to the global challenges and an alternative to the status quo. Thank you.
take a couple of questions.
Hey, hello, Dr. Kennedy.
It's working. It was working.
It's working. Okay, good. Hello, Dr. Kennedy. Thank you so much for visiting us. My name is Pedro. I'm from Venezuela. I'm a political science master student. The description that you did about the UN and international organizations really reminded me of Richard Posner's, well, the critiques to Richard Posner's diss track on utilitarianism. And I was wondering, because I'm starting to learn more about the interactions between law and economics, what was a useful framework to think about when approaching these types of topics, or how to navigate law and economics if you're a newbie in that area. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kennedy. I'm here. I'm Chenda. I'm starting my first year of PhD at Sciences Po. I'm doing international economic law and the idea of economic.
Sorry, the microphone makes you very muddled, so speak slowly in the microphone. Thank you.
I'm doing my PhD in international economic law, especially the idea of the expansion, interpretation of national security and economic security, especially in the friction with the idea of Chinese state capitalism, which is not a liberal way of economic model. And in my project, I see that liberalism is facing majorly two issues. First is that the second biggest economy in the world is not liberal economy. And the second is that we see a lot of unilateral movements that is against and de-risking their economic links with China because they don't want a non-democratic country to filter into their economy. And when we see this kind of frictions between the idea, we're probably like losing our trust into liberalism. But at the same time that the global trade and WTO are organized under this idea of multilateralism, would you think that this is the moment when we see there is a rupture between multilateralism and liberalism? If so, would you think that it's the time for us to change our vocabulary and our narratives? If so, who should do that, or if it is still there to grasp? Thank you.
Hi, yes, I'm Caleb, and I'm studying international development. And the question that I had for the professor was, you talk a lot about the importance of power, or perhaps, if I'm not mischaracterizing, the centrality of power to the analyses that you've been carrying out. And my question was, why would you put power at the center of a lot of these analyses over, say, talking about something like adherence to evidence or predictive proof of a specific social theory? My worry is that with the power framework, it can go a bit too much into complete relativism and say it's not really that a group wins or loses because of any strength of ideas, but purely a power struggle. And I was wondering, as I said, why would you put power first at the center, and then also how would you respond to these concerns? Thank you.
Okay, so really good questions. So if I had a solution, I would have told you right at the beginning. So if there was a kind of recipe that I had worked out in my years of study and reflection, in which if we just got rid of what we have, and when we get rid of the state system, we should all organize ourselves around cities, or whatever. So I think we're not in that kind of a situation. So in which one comprehensive description, like it's a state system, accurately describes what we have. Actually, what we have is a much more hodgepodgey mess of different intersecting arrangements that we don't understand when we try to reduce them to being the state system. And I fear that a solution that tried to be of an equivalent sort, instead of a state system, we're going to have an X system, would be equally blind to the diversity of the situation and the diversity of modes of power and modes of knowledge practice that would be needed for a just society to emerge. So I think I'm not looking for a solution along those lines, and I think foundational rethinking is much more likely to be about identifying a diverse set of aspects of specific practices that are getting in the way of a more equal and just world that we can change and transform. And that kind of, a revolution in many places and many small things is how this world got so screwed up, but also has had such many advantages that it has had. So, and that's how the next phase will also unfold. So, so in other words, I don't have an answer to that. Good question, no answer. So law and economics. So I think law and economics in my country has two faces. So one face is a movement started in the 70s by economists who were trying to help legal scholars who thought policy arguments should be part of legal practice figure out how, when you have a choice between two rules, could you have an informed analysis of which one to pick using economic analysis, and usually using some version of microeconomic analysis with a view that market perfection ought to be the goal and aspiration and be a lead indicator for having chosen the right rule, and then to try to systematize over time in many ways how to make decisions between two possible rules with an economic orientation. And that's had a whole history and has been very influential in lots of places, often in kind of puzzling ways, and that's phase one. Phase two is outside that field, people who feel that understanding economics in a broader, more social, political, macro sense, historical sense, is important to understanding how law is in the world. And that means you really do need to know economics in order to understand law and its meaning, but not in the same way and with the same aspiration to try to use economics as a substitute for political and social judgment about which rule to pick, as if an economic analysis could give you the kind of an answer that legal and political judgment can't give you, but rather to criticize the way in which the law and economics movement has brought economics in and the assumptions about law that they make in what they understand the market to be in the first place and how they understand efficiency to be generated. So a whole series of critical reflections. And I'm in that second school of thinking understanding economics is incredibly important, and understanding the legal dimension of economic life is important in part in order to be skeptical of the claim that some kind of economic model can answer important social questions about how law should be configured. So it's those two different sides of the coin of law and economics that I think need to be sort of looked at and chosen between and understood in some way. I'm not sure that words like liberalism are that helpful anymore. So I think you're right about it. I think they lead us into a kind of a dead end of trying to generalize at a theoretical level about a complex social system by saying it's a liberal system, and then we go and we read some liberal theorist from the 16th century or 18th century probably, and then say, okay, so it must have these characteristics and our society must have those characteristics and that's what we should do. No society is actually like that. And so the societies we call liberal, well, you know, they have elements like that, and societies we call not liberal, well, they have elements that don't really fit. But that's less important than what the similarities and difference and dynamics are between the societies. And I think it's really getting in the way of understanding relations between China and the United States, and I don't know if this is happening in Europe or not, to be imagining the United States as a liberal, capitalist, democratic country, and China as the opposite of those things. This is a kind of mistake we made once before. It's a mistake in how we understand ourselves, and it's a mistake in how we understand China. So I went running around China a few years ago and did a book with a famous economist named Joe Stiglitz about the Chinese economic structure, trying to understand, you know, a market society with Chinese characteristics, what does that actually mean? And what does it concretely translate into? And a lot of the things that even Chinese scholars think are illiberal are kind of recognizable as modes of industrial policy, you know, called a little different thing and administered in a little different way, that are pretty familiar in development economics in lots of places, and lots of what China's doing in the Belt and Road Initiative is similar to things that have been done in other kinds of development strategies, sometimes making the same mistakes, sometimes not. So I see there being many, many more points of similarity between the two countries and the two regimes, because our society isn't like that and their society isn't like that either. That doesn't mean they're not different. It just means that if we start with the idea that each embodies a type, we're going to then have to spend an enormous amount of time finding the details. But if we start with the idea that each society is a complex reality, let's look for similarities and differences without stigmatizing one or the other as liberal or anti-democratic, I think we'll find a lot more interesting things to look at, and it'll be a more interesting possibility for conversation. Why power and not something else? So, well, I probably do make the mistake that you think that people make of thinking, think the aspiration that there's a right answer rather than an answer that's a hegemonic answer. Are there right answers that aren't hegemonic answers? So this is a question of how Foucault-like are you, right? So do you think that knowledge is an effect of power all the way down or only just mostly? So I don't know. I'm sort of skeptical on that. I don't think it matters all that much, except that we underestimate the role of power in the things we take to be true. But I also think we underestimate ideas about truth and ideas about how society is organized in the construction of what counts as power. So I would put those things in a dialogue with each other in a more ongoing way. And when somebody says they have power, I would try to think, what makes you think so? How are you imagining society, yourself, them, us, to imagine that they have power rather than power as an interpretive thing you say after you see the effect of what they do. And when somebody says they finally figured it out and they're speaking an actual uncontroverted truth, I always think, well, I'm skeptical. In other words, I think a spirit of critical inquiry tries not to begin by imagining I'm going to find power or I'm going to find truth, but imagining that they're in some kind of ongoing interaction with one another. And people who try to imagine them separate get into trouble. So, if you work in a think tank, you often think they're the knowledge people and they try to figure out what's going on, and then they're the power people and they make policy, and we're trying to influence the policy people with our knowledge. But everybody in the system knows it's not exactly like that, that the power people are not speaking just a language of power, they're also speaking about what's true and what's right, and they're also telling you about how an economy works. That is, they're speaking a theory of knowledge as the way they do what they do. And everybody understands that the experts are exercising power when they're building this set of knowledge ideas rather than another. So it's this weird thing where we're pretending that they're different and we should choose, but we know they're all mixed up. So I would want to put at the front of our inquiry a kind of attention when somebody says that person has power to, well, what makes you think so? What led to that conclusion? How are you imagining society? How are you imagining identity? So on and so forth. What's the knowledge base of that conclusion you're drawing? And is that right? Maybe you're oversimplifying. Maybe it's more interactive than that or something else like that, right? So anyway, that would be my sense about that. Shall we do a couple more? What's your sense? Yeah. I don't mean to give too long answers, but.
So I saw Theodora, Mustafa, Matthias, and...
Hi, thank you. I think you already replied to the question I wanted to ask. I'm here, yeah. Sorry, it was so I think I've replied already to what I wanted to ask. I wanted to echo some of the lefties' criticisms on your Word of Struggles, which they said it undermines the possibility of analyzing, like systemic analysis, and talking about capitalism, colonialism, imperialism. And so far I think you're fine with that, and you don't consider it as something that you need to reply to, but you accept this. Am I right? Or if not, I would be happy if you explain a bit more, because I'm curious. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Professor. I'm a PhD student in constitutional law. I'm interested in when private power is taken into account, how that would change our imagination about the nature and the role of constitutional law and how constitutional law should be practiced or implemented. So my question is a follow-up question about your last comment on private power and constitution. So it's basically a definition question. So what definition of power do you have in mind when you're talking about power, especially when compare public power and private power? Is it really, are they really comparable? And maybe a follow-up question is that what if some people say that the power that private sector have are actually their rights or the product of their rights from a traditional lens? Thank you very much.
Hi, Professor. I'm Sophia. I'm a master's student in public policy. I was really interested in your discussion about non-state actors within like the constitutional aspect of a state. And I'm Argentinian, so there's a lot of influence of non-state actors, thinking of the IMF and international financial institutions in my country's history, but especially in South American and developing country history. So I was wondering what your perspective is on the growing role of non-state actors that are still influenced by state positions on government development and identity politics. Thank you.
So let me be relatively quick. On the system question, what is the usefulness for a critical project of words like capitalism, racial capitalism, patriarchy? How do those words help or get in the way? So for sure, there's a helpful tradition of trying to get a picture of the overall situation and what its structuring elements are. And so I've learned a lot from system dynamic discussions about center-periphery relations or how leading sectors and lagging sectors, as I said before, so Gunnar Myrdal with his idea that things at the top, if you know, the richer get richer and the poorer get poorer because of a whole series of moves that we can study and that happens in all kinds of different places and so on. So yeah, you get a lot of tips about things like that. But I have the same skepticism about the use of words like capitalism that I have about identity things sometimes. So if you start with the idea, well, yeah, but it's capitalism, you can imagine that it has a history, a destiny, an essence, that it has a logic, that it has a kind of, it's a machine in which, so given capitalism, blah, 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 blah. So, and I don't think that's very useful if you want to get in under the hood and figure out how the thing is put together, and maybe it's not a thing, and maybe it's more complicated than that, and maybe the effort to claim that it is a thing called capitalism is part of what holds it together rather than the thing that enables its critique, and so forth. So I'm just skeptical when those things become more formalized and more iron cagey, and I want to try to take them with a grain of salt, which would be kind of my advice. Not that you can't get something out of looking at that way. So these two questions are both about private actors and constitutional law. So you can imagine constitutional law having two moments in its raison d'etre. So moment one would be if we were to write an accurate description of the legal construction of power in our society, what would go into that? That is, it would be, how are we constituted? How is the political constituted in our society? Well, then if you thought the family was political, you would have, as part of what you were writing down, the constitution of the family. And you would have, if you thought that part of what was political was being situated in a global set of arrangements, you would write those arrangements as important aspects of how we're constituted as a polity. So if the NAFTA treaty has important limitations on what the United States can regulate or in terms of trade with Mexico and Canada, then that would be part of how power in our society is constituted to give Ontario certain entitlements. So that would be an idea about constitution, that it accurately describes the legal arrangements that constitute power in society. Obviously, the actual constitution has nothing to do with that, or very little. So you could imagine a second moment for constitutional law, which is to say, constitutional law comes into a complex situation of power and picks out some elements and privileges them as the space of what they're going to call power and politics. And so it's a project to say these institutions and not those, these people and not those, are the ones who are in charge of the situation. And so it's an empowering of some people and a disempowering of other people, and it's a not noticing of other people. That is, it's a project of redescribing the situation in a way that will be partial to the actual relations of power, but will have consequences. So in other words, it's a political project to narrow our understanding of the political so that we don't notice that Elon Musk is really important in war, because actually he runs a lot of things for the Defense Department, and his power is constituted by his ownership of things through the law of private property. So I would be in favor of trying to get these two constitutional law moments to talk to each other, in which I don't think we need a new constitutional law to take account of Elon Musk. His power is already constituted legally. And so we would just have to notice the laws that already make him a kind of fifth branch of the government. And so on for the Canadians. And so on for the WTO and for the IMF and for non-governmental organizations. So it's not, let's start, so project 2 of describing and carving out the political in a way, let's find a role for Elon Musk. We don't have to find a role for Elon Musk. He already has a role, and it's already legally consecrated and constituted. So now we have a better description. Now we can figure out what there needs to be changed, and whether or not we find the actual constitution of power legally in our society to be one that we want to continue, or one that needs foundational rethinking, and I'd be on the side of thinking it needs a little bit of foundational rethinking. That's it. Yeah, last one.
Yeah, Matthias Thiemann, a short follow-up question on the power-knowledge nexus, and has a lot to do with your presentation, which, if I understood correctly, material and distributive interests disappeared somewhat from study and now are coming back, if I heard you correctly. And could you give us maybe an understanding of what undergirds this? You mentioned the great financial crisis, but the great financial crisis is not a deus ex machina. So what translated the great financial crisis into this reappearance of material and distributive interests that you seem to be describing? Thank you.
So that's a complex sociological, historical question about my society, and we need some sociologists and historians of the present to try to figure that out. But I would say one factor would be the impact on a generation of people understanding that the stories that were being told about the society didn't add up, and the emergence of a whole series of visible movements of transformation at the real popular level. So Liz Warren, Bernie, stuff like that, that gave a generation the feeling, and Black Lives Matter and so forth, that gave a generation the feeling, okay, things that seemed like they were well understood could be rethought in a way that winners and losers could be put on the table. So, you know, something happened. It's a zeitgeist question. Something happened, you know, a funny thing happened at the beginning of the 20th century. A funny thing happened between 2009 and 2019 that questions like that became more visible, and, you know, eventually someday a historian will be able to explain it to us.
All right, so I see a lot of other questions, and I'm really sorry about that, but maybe next time. So thank you so much, David, and thank you all for this great conversation.